Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I'll be analyzing the case of Richard Allen. This is an update to this case as there has been a verdict. First I'll look at the background of the case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Richard Matthew Allen was born on September 9, 1972, and raised in Mexico, Indiana. This town of about 3,000 people is an hour northeast of Lafayette. In 1991, Richard graduated from high school. He studied accounting at a community college, spent time in the Army, and worked as a store manager at Walmart. Richard married, had 2 children, and lived on Whiteman Drive in the town of Delphi, Indiana. This town is about 40 minutes southwest of Mexico, Indiana. Eventually, Richard became a pharmacy technician and worked at a CVS store. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On February 13, 2017, at 1:35 p.m., a 14-year-old girl named Liberty German and her 13-year-old friend, Abigail Williams, were dropped off at County Road 300 North so they could hike on the Delphi historic trails. The girls made their way to the Monon High Bridge, which is also simply called the High Bridge. This railroad bridge, which crosses Deer Creek, was built in 1891 and abandoned in 1987. At 2:07 p.m., Liberty posted an image of Abigail walking on the bridge. About an hour later, the girls failed to meet with a family member as planned. At 5:30 p.m., they were reported missing. On the next day, February 14, at about 12 p.m., their bodies were discovered on the north bank of Deer Creek. Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. Both of the victims had their throats cut. A .40 caliber S&W cartridge was found between the bodies. This cartridge was intact. It had not been discharged. On the day of the murder, February 13, at 2:13 p.m., Liberty used her phone to record a video of a man on the bridge. This man was wearing blue jeans and a blue jacket. As the man approached both Liberty and Abigail, one of the girls said, "Gun." The man said, "Guys, down the hill." One of the girls, probably Liberty, can be heard responding to the man, saying something to the effect of, "There's no path down here. We've got to go down here." The girls then walked toward the south bank of Deer Creek. The last time Liberty's cell phone moved was at 2:32 p.m. The man captured in the video is commonly referred to as Bridge Guy, and of course, he is believed to be the killer. Not long after the murders, Richard Allen contacted the authorities to say he was on the bridge on the day the girls went missing. The police marked the report as cleared and misfiled it using the name Richard Allen Whiteman. Again, Whiteman Drive is where Richard's house is located. This is not his last name. The investigation continued for years. There were a number of suspects, but no significant progress was made. In September 2022, a clerk who organized tips related to the murders stumbled upon the report that Richard had made not long after the crime. The police decided to interview Richard on October 13, 2022. He told them that on February 13, 2017, he was on the trail from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. He made his way to the High Bridge to watch fish. Richard was wearing blue jeans and a blue or black jacket. After hearing the statements, the police searched Richard's home and found a Sig Sauer P226. This is a semi-automatic pistol chambered in .40 caliber S&W. Richard had owned this pistol since 2001. Investigators concluded that the .40 caliber S&W cartridge, which was found between the bodies of the murder victims, had been cycled through this pistol. The cartridge was not fired, of course. Again, it was intact. Rather, somebody manually cycled the action and ejected the cartridge. It's not clear why anyone would do this at a crime scene. Maybe they were inexperienced with how firearms functioned. Richard was interviewed again on October 26, 2022. He told the police that he never let anyone borrow his pistol. After being confronted with this theory about the cartridge, Richard had no explanation. He did not know why a cartridge cycled through his firearm would have been at the crime scene. Despite repeatedly denying involvement in the crime, Richard was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of felony murder. After being held in solitary confinement for a while, Richard developed psychosis and made numerous statements implicating himself. Psychosis was when a person breaks from reality. It is characterized by hallucinations and/or delusions. On October 18, 2024, Richard's trial started. On November 11, he was convicted of all 4 charges. At the time I am making this video, Richard is scheduled to be sentenced on December 20, 2024. He is facing up to 130 years in prison. Now moving to my analysis. Richard Allen maintains his innocence, and he has many supporters. They argue that mental health factors explain Richard's confessions, and no credible evidence connected him to the crime. The state, of course, disagrees. They argue that despite a haphazard and incomplete investigation, Richard's confessions proved his guilt. This brings me to the question, was Richard Allen guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Richard Allen lived within 2.5 miles of the High Bridge and had knowledge of the area. He admitted that he was on the Delphi trails from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. on the day of the murders. His physical appearance is similar to the man captured in the Notorious Bridge Guy video at 2:13 p.m. Richard was about the right age, height, and weight. Furthermore, he admitted to wearing clothes which were similar to what the man in the video was wearing. The police claim that a witness saw Richard's vehicle near the bridge. This witness and another witness spotted a man matching Richard's description in the area. The witnesses who saw the man did not see any other men, which means Richard must have been the man who was spotted. He was the only man there. Other men were spotted after 2:30 p.m., but they did not match the description of the man in the video. In the Bridge Guy video, one of the murder victims mentioned a gun. Richard owned a gun. It was chambered in the same caliber as the cartridge found between the bodies, .40 caliber S&W. The police laboratory claimed that marks on the cartridge matched Richard's pistol. Richard confessed to the murders at least 60 times when he was in jail. His confessions were made to a mental health professional, inmates, jail employees, his mother, and his wife. Richard mentioned how during the attack he saw a van. There was a van in the area at 2:30 p.m. This information was not made public. Some of the investigators believed that the voice of Bridge Guy sounded a lot like Richard Allen. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. The investigation into the murders was badly executed. The police lost evidence, failed to record interviews, and misfiled statements. Some of the evidence which was lost may have helped Richard, but now there's no way to know. Richard does not match the typical profile of someone who would commit the type of crime involved in this case. For example, he was in a stable, romantic relationship, had a history of steady employment, and did not have a criminal record. If Richard was the killer, why did he go to the police? They had no idea that he was on the bridge. Furthermore, why didn't Richard get rid of the gun and move away from Delphi, Indiana? Witnesses may have failed to spot another man on the trail, but that doesn't mean there was not another man there. No DNA and no electronic evidence connected Richard to the crime scene. The police said that a witness spotted Richard's Ford Focus, but the vehicle the witness described did not match a Ford Focus. The police claimed that this witness and another witness saw a man who looked like Richard, but when examining their accounts, it's not clear who they saw. The same witness who allegedly saw Richard's vehicle described a man in his 20s with a medium build. This does not sound like Richard at all. The other witness described a man wearing a tan coat and muddy pants, but the Bridge Guy was wearing a blue coat. The state indicated that a .40 caliber cartridge found at the crime scene had been cycled through Richard's pistol. This connects Richard's pistol to the crime scene. However, it is unlikely that the police were actually able to make this connection. There is no scientific reason to believe that a manually cycled cartridge could be matched to a pistol with any acceptable level of validity. Furthermore, the police repeatedly referred to the cartridge as a bullet. This is a mistake that I see in many affidavits and other documents that the police produce. A cartridge has 4 components: a case, a primer, propellant, and a bullet. A bullet is not the same thing as a cartridge. The bullet is the projectile. Data from the phone of Liberty German indicate that a headphone jack was inserted into her phone at 5:45 p.m. and removed at 10:32 p.m. If this is the case, then the killer was not Richard because he was not at the crime scene during that time. Prior to being held in solitary confinement, Richard repeatedly denied involvement in the murders. Mental health factors could explain why Richard repeatedly confessed. According to one mental health clinician, Richard was depressed, psychotic, and had dependent personality disorder. This is a cluster C personality disorder that involves a person being highly dependent on others. They are typically needy and vulnerable. The mental health clinician said that Richard was not faking his symptoms. Surveillance video of Richard in solitary confinement captured him in his cell naked, consuming feces, and banging his head on a wall. Richard's confessions did not match the physical evidence. For example, he claimed that the girls had been shot, but they were both killed with an edged weapon. He claimed that he buried the victims, but they were not buried. And Richard said that he killed his grandchildren and other family members, but no one else had been killed. In a prior video, I talked about a theory promoted by Richard's attorneys who suggested that followers of Odin had been involved in a conspiracy to commit the murders. This theory was not allowed to be introduced at trial. However, 3 officers who investigated the murders believed this theory was true. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Richard Allen was guilty of murder? In an earlier video on this case, I believed that Richard was guilty in reality, but I was not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. My position has not changed based on the evidence presented at trial. There is no evidence connecting Richard to the crime except his confessions and his statement that he was on the bridge around the time of the murders. I probably would have been convinced by the confessions if they had been made before his mental health deteriorated. As I mentioned, I do believe that Richard is guilty in reality. He probably is the killer. I think what happened in this case is that Richard committed the murders and then became concerned about what evidence he left behind. He wanted to know what the police had. In order to alleviate his anxiety and to avoid looking guilty, he contacted them. It was a preemptive strike. Richard didn't want the police to realize later on that he was on the bridge because that would look suspicious. Then the police would say, "Why didn't this guy reach out to us?" Even though they had been handed their best lead, the police misfiled the report. Richard didn't see any need to destroy evidence or to leave the area. He thought that he had beaten the system. Years later, after he was arrested, the pressure in jail became too much for him, which led to the confessions. Historically, jury members tend to be very convinced by confessions, even if those confessions are delivered by a person suffering from mental health symptoms. They also tend to disregard denials and confessions to crimes that never happened, and focus only on plausible confessions. Whether Richard is guilty or not, talking to the police is what led to his conviction. He never would have been arrested if he did not implicate himself. Now moving to my final thoughts. When the Delphi murders were first reported, it was clear this case was going to be high profile. It involved a terrible double murder committed by a stranger in broad daylight. There may have been one perpetrator, multiple perpetrators, nobody knew. The victims in this case were innocent, and the crime scene was horrible. Furthermore, one of the murder victims heroically recorded the killer. She did everything she could to ensure the killer would be apprehended. This move was incredibly brave. Unfortunately, the police could not capitalize on this effort due to their own incompetence. They misfiled Richard's admission that he was on the bridge, and they pushed him off the radar. Later, after their mistake was discovered by a volunteer clerk, they tried to make it up by pressing forward regardless of the evidence. This led to their big break in the form of mental health-induced confessions. It seems very likely that Richard Allen is going to appeal his convictions, but if those appeals are not successful, the case is closed. So this is it for Richard. He's going to be sentenced to life in prison, probably, and that's going to be it. Unfortunately, despite what seems like closure, a lot of doubt remains in this case. Is the right man incarcerated, or did incarceration lead to a confession? Either way, Richard will spend his life in prison, and the investigators will spend their lives trying to erase the stain of their incompetence. Those are my thoughts on the case of the Richard Allen verdict. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. One interesting element that stands out to me in this case, the case of the Delphi murders, is how the police have to sift through thousands of leads when working this type of investigation. It's not easy. It can be very tempting to look at any one piece of evidence, any interview, any small piece of physical evidence, anything at all, and disregard it. Because this is what happens most of the time, meaning most of the evidence is not significant. Most of the words spoken by witnesses will not break the case wide open. The vast majority of the work that the police do is for nothing. At least that's the way it seems. What they don't realize sometimes is the importance of staying the course, of looking for that evidence that will be significant. We see in many investigations that the important evidence, the key evidence, the evidence that did break the case wide open, was ignored in the beginning. In this case, it was just plain disregarded. It was misfiled, and that seemed to be the end of it. This investigation almost did not lead to an arrest. It was that close to failing completely. And of course, it did kind of fail, ultimately. Even though there was a conviction, as I mentioned, there's a lot of doubt. So it's not a satisfying conviction. It's very easy to look at this case and think, I wonder if the wrong man went to prison. So I guess the lesson here is just pay attention to the details. When conducting an investigation of any type, when handling a large amount of data, it's important to always be diligent, to examine everything with the same level of professionalism and scrutiny and logic, and not to get caught up in this idea that, oh, this is just another worthless interview. Sometimes the person who is being interviewed may actually be the killer.